89% of men who develop what psychologists call catastrophic relationship schemas experience their first romantic rejection between ages 14 and 17, during the peak neuroplasticity window when the brain is literally rewiring its understanding of love, trust, and vulnerability. Arthur Schopenhauer was 16 when the woman he idealized chose someone else, and in that moment, something inside him didn't just break, it calcified. What he wrote decades later in his infamous essay On Women wasn't philosophy. It was a 40-year echo of a teenage boy's wound that never healed, dressed up in intellectual armor so thick that it fooled generations of readers into thinking they were learning about women when they were really witnessing the anatomy of unprocessed pain. Here's what most people miss when they encounter Schopenhauer's brutal words about women. They think they're reading observations. They think they're discovering some hidden truth that society has been hiding from them. But you're not reading philosophy when you read Schopenhauer on women. You're reading a psychological case study in what happens when a brilliant mind uses its own intelligence as a weapon against its own heart. And the uncomfortable truth? This pattern didn't die with Schopenhauer in 1860. It's alive in every comment section, every bitter monologue, every man who's decided that understanding women means cataloging their supposed deficiencies rather than examining his own capacity to connect. Schopenhauer called women the second sex, inferior in intellect, childish in temperament, incapable of true reasoning. He wrote that their entire existence was ornamental, that their beauty was nature's trick to ensure reproduction, that they lived solely through men and for men. Reading these words today feels like watching someone build an elaborate philosophical fortress around a very simple, very human pain. Because here's what research in attachment psychology reveals. When we experience deep relational trauma during our formative years, especially during adolescence when our identity is still forming, the brain doesn't just remember the event, it creates entire operating systems designed to ensure that level of pain never happens again. You see this mechanism everywhere once you know what to look for. The teenage boy who gets humiliated by his first crush doesn't just move on. Something inside him starts building. Wall by wall, belief by belief, defense by defense. The pain is too intense, too destabilizing, so the psyche does something ingenious and devastating at the same time. It reframes the entire experience. She didn't reject me because of circumstances, compatibility, or her own complex inner world. She rejected me because women are fundamentally different, fundamentally flawed, fundamentally dangerous. And if I can understand their flaws, catalog their patterns, predict their moves, then I'll never be vulnerable like that again. This is what psychologists call defensive intellectualization. You take an emotional wound and you transform it into an intellectual framework. You study, you analyze, you develop theories. It feels like power. It feels like wisdom. But here's the thing that makes this pattern so insidious. The more intelligent you are, the more convincing your framework becomes. Schopenhauer wasn't some bitter fool ranting in a tavern. He was one of the sharpest philosophical minds of the 19th century. His work on pessimism, on the nature of suffering, on the will to live, these were genuine contributions to human thought, which meant when he turned that same analytical brilliance toward women, the resulting theories sounded profound. They sounded like truth. But truth and trauma, wearing truth's clothing, are not the same thing. Modern neuroscience shows us something fascinating about how the brain processes rejection during adolescence. The same neural pathways that activate during physical pain light up during social rejection, especially romantic rejection. Your brain literally cannot tell the difference between being punched and being rejected by someone you've idealized. Both register as threats to survival. Both trigger the amygdala's fight or flight response. Both leave neural signatures that can last a lifetime. When Schopenhauer was building his philosophy, he was brilliant enough to observe patterns. He saw that romantic love often led to suffering. He noticed that attraction could override rational judgment. He recognized that relationships often involve power dynamics and strategic behavior. All of these observations contain kernels of truth. But here's where the trauma distorts the lens. Instead of seeing these as universal human patterns that men and women both participate in, he filtered everything through a binary. Men as rational, women as manipulative. Men as victims, women as perpetrators. Men as seekers of truth, women as obstacles to enlightenment. This is the brutal lesson, but not the one Schopenhauer thought he was teaching. The lesson isn't about women at all. The lesson is about what happens when you let an unhealed wound become your worldview. It's about how the most dangerous lies are the ones sophisticated enough to masquerade as wisdom. It's about recognizing that every time you find yourself thinking you've figured out the opposite sex, you might just be building an elaborate theory to protect yourself from having to risk connection again. The psychology behind this runs deeper than most people realize. There's a concept in attachment theory called an internal working model. It's the blueprint your psyche creates for how relationships work based on your early experiences. If your formative romantic experiences involve rejection, humiliation, or betrayal, your internal working model doesn't just note that as data. It becomes the template. It becomes the prediction engine. It whispers every time you meet someone new. This is how it ends. This is what they'll do. This is why you can't trust. Schopenhauer's entire philosophical pessimism, his belief that life is suffering and that the will to live is a cosmic curse, this wasn't separate from his views on women. They were intertwined, because in his framework, romantic love was the ultimate trap. It was the will to live using beauty and desire as bait, tricking men into reproduction, into attachment, into the vulnerability that leads to inevitable suffering. He saw through it, he told himself. He was too wise to fall for nature's trick again. And here's what makes this tragic. By the time you're constructing philosophical systems to explain why connection is dangerous, you've already lost something essential. You've traded the possibility of intimacy for the illusion of control. You've chosen to be the expert on why relationships fail, rather than risk being the student who learns how they succeed. Research from the Gottman Institute shows that the strongest predictor of relationship failure isn't conflict or even incompatibility. It's contempt. When one partner begins to view the other as fundamentally inferior, fundamentally flawed, fundamentally other, the relationship is already over. It's just a matter of time. But here's the uncomfortable truth that sits at the heart of Schopenhauer's legacy. His ideas about women didn't die with him. They got recycled, repackaged, and redistributed through every generation since. You see them in evolutionary psychology arguments that reduce human behavior to reproductive strategies. You see them in pickup artist communities that treat relationships as games to be won. You see them in every online space where men gather to discuss women as a problem to be solved rather than as individual human beings navigating their own complex inner worlds. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that Schopenhauer saw something uniquely true about women, but that he articulated something uniquely appealing to a specific kind of male pain. The pain of rejection transformed into the comfort of explanation. The vulnerability of desire reframed as intellectual superiority. The loneliness of disconnection justified as enlightened solitude. These ideas spread not because they're accurate, but because they offer something seductive to men who are hurting. They offer absolution without growth, understanding without vulnerability, expertise without connection. Modern psychology has a term for this. It's called cognitive dissonance reduction. When we experience the discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs, our minds work overtime to resolve the tension. I want connection versus connection leads to pain. I desire women versus desire makes me vulnerable. The elegant solution? Decide that what you want isn't actually worth having. Decide that the fox didn't want the grapes anyway because they were probably sour. Decide that women aren't worth the risk because they're fundamentally incapable of the depth, loyalty, or understanding that you deserve. But here's what happens in your nervous system when you adopt this framework. You're not actually protecting yourself. You're creating what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy. You approach interactions with suspicion. You interpret ambiguous behavior as confirmation of your theories. You test women in ways that are designed to prove your beliefs rather than discover who they actually are. And when the relationship inevitably fails because you've been relating to your theories rather than to an actual person, you tell yourself you were right all along. You saw through it. You predicted it. You were too smart to be fooled. Except you weren't smart. You were scared. And there's a profound difference between wisdom and elaborate rationalization of fear. Schopenhauer spent his entire adult life alone. By choice, he would have said. By necessity, his nervous system might have replied. if it could speak. Because once you've built an entire philosophical system explaining why connection is impossible, the thought of dismantling that system, of being wrong, of having wasted decades protecting yourself from something you actually desperately needed, that thought becomes more terrifying than the loneliness itself. This is where the pattern gets really insidious. The longer you hold these beliefs, the more they shape your reality. Neuroscientists call this confirmation bias on steroids. Your brain becomes so efficient at filtering information through your established worldview that contradictory evidence doesn't even register. You meet women who are kind, intelligent, emotionally mature, and your brain automatically searches for the hidden angle, the eventual betrayal, the proof that it's all an act. Because if they're genuine, if connection is actually possible, then what have you been doing all this time? What have you been protecting yourself from? The research on this is sobering. Men who adopt what psychologists call hostile attribution bias toward women, the assumption that women's actions are motivated by malice or manipulation, they don't just struggle in romantic relationships. They struggle, period. Their cortisol levels are chronically elevated. Their capacity for trust atrophies. Their ability to experience joy in connection diminishes. They become so focused on not being hurt that they lose the ability to be touched, moved, affected by another person's presence in their life. And here's the paradox that would have fascinated Schopenhauer if he'd had the self-awareness to see it. His entire philosophy was about the inevitability of suffering, about how the will to live keeps us trapped in cycles of desire and disappointment. But the deepest suffering in his life wasn't the suffering he philosophized about. It was the suffering he created by refusing to be vulnerable enough to truly connect. It was the suffering of the brilliant mind that convinced itself it had transcended the need for intimacy, when really it had just armored against the risk. You can see this pattern playing out in real time on social media, in men's forums, in comment sections where Schopenhauer's ideas get cited like scripture, men sharing his quotes about women's supposed intellectual inferiority, their aesthetic existence, their childlike nature, and underneath every shared quote, every knowing nod of agreement, you can feel the pain humming, the rejection that hasn't been processed, the vulnerability that was mistaken for weakness, the desire for connection that got reframed as a trap to be avoided. But here's what contemporary research on relationships and attachment reveals. And it's something Schopenhauer never got to learn because the science didn't exist yet. The patterns we see in romantic relationships aren't fixed characteristics of men or women. They're dynamic responses to how safe we feel with each other. When you approach someone with suspicion, they respond with guardedness. When you approach with contempt, they respond with defensiveness. When you approach with the assumption that they're fundamentally flawed, they either internalize it and shrink, or they reject you and confirm your theories. Either way, you've created the reality you feared. The alternative, the one that requires actual courage rather than intellectual posturing, is vulnerability. It's approaching each person as a unique individual rather than a representative of their gender. It's recognizing that your theories about women tell you more about your own wounds than about the actual human standing in front of you. It's having the humility to admit that maybe, just maybe, the patterns you keep seeing say more about the lens you're looking through than the reality you're observing. This doesn't mean ignoring red flags. It doesn't mean being naive about the fact that some people, regardless of gender, can be manipulative or hurtful. But there's a universe of difference between healthy discernment and defensive cynicism. Healthy discernment says, this particular person's behavior doesn't align with my values or needs. Defensive cynicism says, all women are fundamentally this way, and I figured out the code. The tragedy of Schopenhauer's brutal lesson isn't just that it was wrong about women, it's that it was wrong about what wisdom actually looks like. Real wisdom isn't about building elaborate theories that protect you from pain. It's about developing the capacity to stay open even when you've been hurt. It's about recognizing that every person you meet is as complex, contradictory, and capable of growth as you are. It's about understanding that the opposite of vulnerability isn't strength. It's isolation masquerading as enlightenment. There's a reason why, near the end of his life, Schopenhauer's writings took on a different tone. Not about women, he never reconsidered those views, but about compassion, about the fundamental unity of all suffering beings. It's as if some part of him understood that his philosophical pessimism had led him to a lonely place, and that maybe, just maybe, the answer to suffering wasn't intellectual superiority over others, but recognition of our shared fragility. But by then, it was too late to rebuild what he'd spent a lifetime dismantling. Here's what most people don't realize when they're drawn to Schopenhauer's ideas about women. They think they're gaining insight. They think they're seeing through illusions, but what you're actually doing is inheriting someone else's unprocessed trauma and calling it wisdom. You're taking on a 19th century philosopher's defense mechanisms and pretending they're observations about human nature. You're repeating patterns that didn't serve him and won't serve you, but they feel powerful because they give you a framework, a vocabulary, a sense of understanding in a confusing world. The psychology behind this runs even deeper. When we're in pain, especially the pain of rejection or loneliness, our brains crave explanations. We need the chaos to make sense. We need the hurt to have meaning. And explanations that place the problem outside ourselves, that locate the flaw in others rather than in our own capacity to connect. These explanations are seductive because they relieve us of the hardest work. The work of looking inward, the work of healing, the work of risking connection again despite what happened before. But here's the uncomfortable truth that sits beneath all of Schopenhauer's brilliant, bitter words. The lesson he left wasn't about women at all. It was a warning written in invisible ink, visible only to those willing to look closely. The warning says this: brilliance without self-awareness is just sophisticated delusion. Philosophical systems built on unhealed wounds will always sound profound until you realize they're just elaborate ways of saying, I'm hurt and I don't know how to heal, so I'll make my hurt into a worldview. You can spend your life studying his arguments, memorizing his observations, citing his conclusions. Or you can recognize that the brutal lesson isn't the one he thought he was teaching. The brutal lesson is what happens when you let adolescent pain become adult philosophy, when you let one person's rejection become a theory about all people, when you choose to be right about why connection is impossible, rather than brave enough to discover how connection becomes possible. The alternative exists. It always has. It's messier than philosophy. It's riskier than theories. It requires admitting that you don't have it all figured out, that your pain doesn't give you special insight into half the human population, that wisdom might look less like knowing why relationships fail and more like learning how to show up authentically even when you're terrified. It requires recognizing that the woman who rejected Schopenhauer when he was 16 wasn't a representative of all women. She was a specific person making a specific choice in a specific moment, and what he did with that pain was his choice, not his destiny. Every person reading this who's ever been drawn to Schopenhauer's views on women, you're not drawn to truth. You're drawn to permission. Permission to not try anymore. Permission to not risk anymore. Permission to transform your fear into intellectual superiority and call it enlightenment. But here's what that permission costs. It costs you the possibility of genuine connection. It costs you relationships with actual humans rather than with your theories about them. It costs you the chance to discover that maybe, just maybe, your pain was real, but your conclusions were just one scared person's attempt to never feel that way again. And maybe that's the real story. Not that Schopenhauer saw something true that everyone else was too naive to see, but that he showed us, with heartbreaking clarity, what it looks like when someone brilliant enough to see patterns, but not courageous enough to question their own lens. When someone would rather be certain in their cynicism than vulnerable in their hope. When someone mistakes the absence of vulnerability for the presence of wisdom. The brutal lesson Schopenhauer left wasn't about women. It was about what we lose when we let our wounds write our philosophies. It was about the difference between understanding human behavior and using understanding as armor against human connection. It was about how the most sophisticated defense mechanisms are often the ones that sound like profound observations about the world, when they're really just elaborate ways of saying, I'm afraid to try again. You get to choose. You can inherit his framework and wonder why you're alone despite being so perceptive. Or you can recognize that perception without compassion is just another form of blindness. That wisdom without vulnerability is just intelligence in service of fear. that the brutal lesson worth learning isn't about women at all. It's about what happens when you confuse protecting yourself with understanding the world, and how the price of that confusion is paid in decades of connection you convinced yourself you were too smart to need.